Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
You can feel the fake warmth of my mother's house before you even walk inside. White roses on the porch. Bless this nest, in perfect cursive on a wooden sign, and the smell of something burnt underneath all that glazed ham and cinnamon-sprinkled lies. I stood on the stoop for an extra second, just enough time to consider walking away before this mess even began. But I didn't. I knocked, even though I had a key. I wanted them to know I wasn't just barging in anymore. Not today. Meredith, yes, she insists on being called by her first name now, opened the door wearing a pink cardigan that probably cost more than my car insurance, her hair curled to the same stiff perfection it always was on holidays. She air-kissed me like I was some distant relative she barely remembered and said something like, "Oh good, you made it," which is her way of saying, "I was sure you'd bail like last time." I smiled. Tight. Hollow. Wouldn't miss it, I lied. She smelled like Chanel and control. Inside, it was all exactly as I'd pictured. Evan in his usual spot near the head of the table, Janine pretending she didn't notice me walk in, even though she was wearing heels loud enough to wake the dead. Everything color-coded like a Pinterest board, lavender napkins, golden eggs on the mantel, a big honey ham that looked like it had been photo-edited into real life. I gave a polite wave to the room. "Hi, everybody," I said, sounding like a guest in a place I used to call home. "Claire. Look who finally shows up on time for once." Evan was already on his second mimosa and that fake laugh he uses when he's about to say something mean enough to draw blood, but soft enough to pass as a joke. "Almost didn't recognize you. Must be the glow of single life." That was his opener. He grinned, real pleased with himself. Janine's mouth twitched like she was holding in a laugh. I looked at her and made a mental note. Count to 5 before answering anything today. "Still single, huh?" Evan asked, louder now, like this was a punchline the room had been waiting for. "Or did you finally download one of those cougar apps?" There it was. The jab. The moment we all knew was coming. I held his stare while chewing a piece of bacon that tasted like cardboard dipped in family guilt. I could have laughed it off, like I used to. I could have rolled my eyes and let it die in the silence. But something in me had shifted. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was just finally done playing the quiet, agreeable version of myself they liked better. I swallowed slowly, dabbed the corner of my mouth with the stupid pastel napkin, and said it without flinching. "Married. Just not to anyone toxic enough to be invited here." Dead silence. The kind that doesn't even have the decency to cough. Evan's jaw twitched like he'd bit into a lemon. Janine froze mid-sip, and her mimosa dripped onto the white tablecloth like punctuation. My mother blinked 3 times before finding her voice. "Married?" she asked, like I'd confessed to a crime. I nodded, calm as anything. For a while now, actually. You could almost hear the math calculations happening in everyone's heads. When, how, who, and most importantly, why didn't we know? But they didn't ask any of that. Not right away. They just stared like I'd set off a smoke bomb in the center of the room, and now we were all waiting to see who was gonna choke first. Evan leaned back in his chair and laughed, once, sharp and bitter. "You always were dramatic." That was his comeback. Not congrats. Not who is he. Just that little dismissal he always defaulted to when he didn't get to control the story. I smiled and took a sip of my orange juice. "You've always been boring, Evan. I guess we all play to our strengths." The tension rolled like heat off the table. My mother cleared her throat. Janine shifted uncomfortably, probably wondering what else I'd been hiding and whether it might involve her. Nobody asked the next obvious question, so I let it hang there. I wasn't going to spoon-feed them my truth. Not today. I looked down at my phone, pretending to read a message even though I knew exactly what I was about to do. "I need to take this," I said, already standing. "Business call?" Meredith asked, desperate to reassert some normalcy. "Something like that," I answered, heading for the door. I stepped outside, closing the front door behind me as quietly as I could. The spring air hit me like a wave of relief, honest, fresh, and indifferent to the tension behind me. I pulled out my phone and hit the call button on the pinned contact at the top of my screen. 1 ring. 2. "Hey," came the voice on the other end. Steady. Familiar. Hers. "Is it time?" she asked, her voice smooth like river stones. I looked back at the house, at the tight smiles pressed against the window panes, the porcelain perfection cracking just beneath the surface. "Oh yeah," I said, heart beating steady now. "Let's begin." I stepped off the porch like I was walking out of a courtroom where I had just dropped the final piece of damning evidence, not even needing to look back to know the fire had already started to spread. My phone was already ringing by the time I reached the side gate, the cold brick of it pressed to my cheek like armor, a barrier between me and the mess I'd left behind. "Hey," Harper's voice was low, grounded, and calm in the way only someone who's survived real storms knows how to be. "You good?" she asked, though I could tell by her tone she already knew I wasn't. "Define good," I muttered, wiping a sweat bead from my temple, though it was barely 60 degrees out. "I just told them I'm married, and now I'm outside pretending to look for cell service while the walls melt from tension." Harper laughed, that deep-chested kind of chuckle that always made me feel like I'd survived something just by hearing it. Did Evan combust or just seethe silently like usual? I looked around the side yard where my mother used to plant tulips before she decided fake ones were easier to maintain. "He made a sound like someone punched his soul," I said. Then Janine spilled her drink like her hand got slapped by God. "You want me to come in?" Harper asked, and it wasn't just a polite question, it was a warning. When Harper walks into a room, she doesn't apologize for taking up space. She's the kind of woman who can defuse a bomb or become one, depending on what the situation requires. "Not yet," I said, my voice softer now. "Just hold position. I need a few more minutes to twist the knife." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that had nothing to do with hesitation and everything to do with trust. Harper knew how I'd been raised. She'd seen it in the way I flinched when my mother texted at odd hours, in the way I double-checked locks, in the way I avoided mirrors during holidays. She knew about the courthouse wedding, the rushed vows in front of a justice of the peace who asked if we were sure about this, and we both nodded like we were grabbing the last life raft on a sinking ship. We'd kept the marriage quiet, not because we were ashamed, but because we knew exactly how my family operated: politeness as a weapon, silence as a shield, shame passed around the dinner table like a side dish nobody asked for. When I told my mother I was in love with a woman, she didn't yell or cry. She just looked at me and said, "Well, if that's your choice, don't expect to be part of this family anymore." I didn't argue. I just left the room and never really came back, not in the way they wanted. I ended the call with Harper by saying what I always say before we go into battle: "Be ready." She replied the same way she always does, always. By the time I walked back inside, the room was trying hard to recover its carefully curated sense of normal. Evan was refilling his glass like he hadn't just been publicly humiliated, cracking a loud joke to Janine about how kids these days get married at gas stations or something. My mother was back to fussing with the silverware like symmetry could fix emotional collapse. I slid into my seat and picked up my fork like I hadn't just detonated a truth bomb 15 minutes ago. Janine was the first to speak, her tone fake bright and just a little too high. "So where did you two meet?" she asked, drawing out the word "you" like she was daring me to say the wrong thing. I didn't take the bait. I tilted my head slightly and smiled. "At a firing range," I said, stabbing a slice of ham with unnecessary force. "Harper taught me how to shoot. Turns out she's better at aiming than most people are at speaking without being condescending." Evan snorted into his drink. "Makes sense. A woman like you probably needs protection, huh?" I looked him square in the eye and said, "No, I married her because she doesn't ask questions she isn't ready to hear the answers to." Janine tried to change the subject, asking me if I still lived in that tiny apartment downtown, her voice sweet enough to rot teeth. I shook my head. "No, I moved out 2 years ago." bought a place. Actually, 5 places. For rental properties and 1 duplex, that's like 6 houses. Technically, that makes me a landlord times 3, right? There was a beat of silence before Evan muttered, "Math isn't your strong suit, huh?" I just smiled wider. "Still better than your people skills." My mother cleared her throat so loudly it almost qualified as a threat. "Claire, could we just have a peaceful brunch for once?" she asked, voice tight as piano wire. "Oh, I'm peaceful," I said. "But don't ask questions if you're not prepared to sit with the answers." As I said that, I heard it, just a whisper, barely above a breath. Janine leaned over toward my mother and said, "I heard she got money from that guy she dated, the one who died." She probably thought I hadn't heard her. That it was just a throwaway comment between women who share shade-like dessert recipes. But I heard it, every syllable. I didn't flinch. I didn't react. I just slowly turned my head and looked at her, the kind of look that says, "Congratulations, you just opened the wrong door." And then I smiled. Not wide, not fake, but the kind of smile you give someone right before you tell them everything they've been afraid to know. "Interesting theory," I said, voice low and calm. "Would you like to hear the full story?" Janine blinked, suddenly unsure. Evan frowned. My mother shifted in her chair, suddenly very, very quiet. The air got thick again, heavy with expectation, and I leaned back in my seat like I had all the time in the world. Because I did. And they were going to hear every damn word. There's a moment, right before you rip the curtain off a long-buried secret, where everything seems to slow down, like even the air around you knows something irreversible is about to happen, and it holds its breath the same way people do when they pass a wreck on the highway. Equal parts horror and fascination. That's exactly what the room felt like after Janine let her little comment slip, after she leaned into that low, gossipy whisper that women like her wear like a second skin, never expecting someone like me to fire back. I could have let it go, I really could have, because God knows I've let worse slide off my back like rain on a slicker, but something about her tone, the smugness in it, the way she used the word died, like it was some punchline. I wasn't going to leave that lying on the table. Not anymore. Not now that Harper was waiting outside with the engine running, just in case the conversation turned into a fire we had to escape. I picked up my water glass and swirled the ice like I was stirring a memory. "Yes," I said, clearly, steadily, with no hesitation, "I did date a man named Carl. And yes, he died. In a car crash. On Highway 37. At night. Raining. Alone." The words hung in the room like fog, heavy and impossible to ignore. Evan leaned forward slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching, not sure if he was about to grin or grimace. "And what was he, 20 years older than you?" he asked, voice low but still laced with that familiar sarcasm he thinks makes him sound clever. 17, I corrected, because if you're going to own the skeletons in your closet, you might as well dress them properly. And I didn't know he was married at first. Found out 6 months in, right around the time I was already trying to figure out how to walk away without setting fire to the whole damn thing. Meredith let out a sound like a cough swallowed a gasp, her fingers clutching her pearl necklace like it might protect her from the incoming wave of honesty. "Claire, this really isn't the time," she started, but I cut her off with a look that shut her down faster than any sentence could. "He was kind to me," I continued, voice level, eyes steady. "Carl treated me like I mattered, like I was more than just some disappointment to be tolerated. He listened. He remembered things. He didn't make me feel like every emotion I had was some inconvenience to be repackaged as drama." Janine shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable now, suddenly aware that the room had turned and she was no longer safe behind her smug little comment. Evan tried to regain the upper hand with one of his classic lines, leaning back with that same smirk he's worn since he was 12. "So you did sleep your way into a bank account," he said, smugness thick like motor oil in his voice. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just smiled, slow and dangerous. He left me money, I said, because I was the only person in his life who didn't make him feel like shit. That line hit harder than a slap, and the silence afterward was loud enough to ring in your ears. Meredith's fork clattered against her plate, her hands trembling slightly now. I could see it in her eyes. The memory she tried to bury was clawing its way up, and she knew exactly what I was about to say next. He told me things, I said, leaning forward slightly, my voice dropping just enough to pull everyone in closer. He told me things about you, Mom. The color drained from her face like water down a sink. Evan blinked, confusion mixing with growing suspicion, and Janine just stared, probably wondering if she was about to watch a family implode live over deviled eggs and baby potatoes. He said you used to visit his office, I continued, not raising my voice, not backing down. He said you knew him long before I ever did. Said he recognized my eyes. Said he always wondered if I might be his. That was the moment everything cracked. Evan knocked over his glass, Janine sucked in a breath like she'd been punched, and Meredith looked like she might actually faint. That's a lie, she said, but even her voice sounded brittle, like it didn't believe itself anymore. I shrugged. DNA said otherwise, I replied. But for a good couple years, I wondered. And you let me wonder. You let me think that maybe the reason you couldn't love me like you loved him was because I reminded you of a mistake you never forgave yourself for. Evan's voice came back, sharp and angry. So that's what this is all about? You're bitter over some dead guy and mommy issues. He spat the words like venom, like they were supposed to hurt. But I wasn't bitter. I was free. No, Evan, I said slowly, deliberately. This is about how none of you ever asked what really happened. You just whispered, you assumed, you judged. You never once looked me in the eye and said, Claire, what happened? I turned to my mother then, stared her down like a witness on trial. Tell him, I said. Tell him what Carl told you. Or should I? Meredith's lips parted, but nothing came out, just that pale, frozen look of someone who realizes too late that silence doesn't save you, it just delays the reckoning. Evan stood, chair scraping across the floor like a gunshot, and for a second, I thought he might actually walk away. But he didn't. He waited. The room held its breath. And I held the truth. For one more second. Just long enough for them to understand that the next words I said were going to change everything. For a second, maybe two at most, the room existed in a stunned vacuum where even the air felt too ashamed to move, like it didn't want to be part of what was unfolding right there at the perfectly arranged brunch table, next to the bowl of fruit salad and the resurrected family casserole from a recipe card older than me. Meredith's lips were moving, but no sound came out at first, just this rapid blinking of her eyes like she thought she could bat away the memory clawing its way out of the dark place she buried it decades ago. Evan looked from her to me and back again like a kid caught in the middle of two parents, finally saying all the things they were never supposed to say in front of the children. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again, like a fish out of water that couldn't decide if it was better to breathe or drown in this moment. You're making things up, Meredith finally spat, voice cracked and sharp, rising with each word like she thought volume might overpower truth. Carl never said anything like that to you. You're lying. You're always dramatic. You twist things. You always have. I expected the denial. Honestly, I did. I counted on it. That was Meredith's specialty, gaslight and redirect, discredit and diminish. She'd rather call me unstable than admit she ever did anything beneath her porcelain exterior. But her voice was shaking. She knew I wasn't bluffing. She knew damn well I didn't need to. I was 17, I said, my voice steady but louder now, pushing through the storm clouds forming over her carefully arranged centerpiece. When he told me, I hadn't seen him in over a year. He found me at a bookstore downtown. Sat across from me at the cafe inside, like he had something stuck in his throat. Told me he couldn't die without getting it off his chest. Janine was frozen now, clutching her wine glass like a lifeline, probably realizing she had waded into water way over her head when she decided to play gossip games. Evan sat back down, slowly, not because he believed me yet, but because he needed to understand where the hell this was going. Meredith shook her head over and over, but she still didn't speak, her mouth clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. I didn't stop. I couldn't. Not after spending my whole life being labeled the emotional one, the oversensitive child, the unstable girl with a wild imagination and too many inconvenient memories. Carl told me he and you were together. I continued, keeping my eyes locked on hers, months before you found out you were pregnant. He said it was never serious. He said you were both too messed up and too lonely to know better. But when you stopped calling and he heard through some friend that you were having a baby, he started wondering. My voice didn't crack and I didn't blink. He thought I might be his daughter. Evan's fist slammed against the table so hard that one of the deviled eggs toppled off its tray. Jesus Christ, Claire, he shouted, his face red and furious, though I couldn't tell if the anger was for me or for the possibility that his perfect family portrait had just developed a hairline fracture. Calm down, Evan, I said, waving one hand dismissively like his tantrum was background noise. You're not in a courtroom. You don't get to intimidate your way through this one. Meredith stood up so fast her chair screeched against the tile floor, her face pale as bone, and her voice finally found its strength, but not the kind that's earned. That man was a liar, she hissed. He was married. He cheated. He drank. And now you're going to take his word over mine. I stared at her for a long, silent moment, the air so still it felt like the whole house had stopped to listen. No, I said, my tone even. I didn't take his word. I took a DNA test. And guess what, Mom? It said he wasn't the father. But you know what's funny? I let all of you wonder for a while. I let the silence eat you alive. Because I wanted you to feel what it's like to question the only truth you've ever clung to. The silence that followed that confession was the loudest one yet, like every fork and plate and Easter napkin in that room knew something irreversible had just been spoken out loud. Janine was the first to break it, her voice small but sharp. So you lied, she asked, as if somehow that made me the villain again, as if weaponizing my pain was worse than the years I'd spent being gaslit by a family that liked me better when I stayed quiet and broken. No, I said. I gave you all the same thing I got from this family my whole life, confusion, doubt, and a sense that maybe I was never really wanted here. It's not lying when it's just a mirror, Janine. Evan stood again, slower this time, his voice low and cold. You seriously think you're the victim here? He asked. You've always had this thing where you need to be the center of attention. Now you're using a dead man to rewrite history. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw the little boy I used to protect from bullies even when he pretended he didn't know me. I saw the teenager who once told me I'd be prettier if I smiled more. I saw the man who stood by every time Meredith chipped away at me and called it love. No, I said. I don't need to rewrite anything. I'm just finally telling it the way it happened. And then I stood up too, slow and steady, and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up, Harper's name glowing at the top. I didn't say much. Just, Harper, come meet them. Bring the folder. I ended the call before Meredith could speak again, before Evan could launch another defense, before Janine could shrivel into whatever shadow she came from. I put the phone back in my pocket and looked at each of them one by one. You wanted answers? I said. You're about to get every one of them. And then I walked to the front door, calm and slow, like the truth wasn't heavy at all, because for the first time in my life, it finally wasn't. The moment I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, the sun hit me in the face like a spotlight on center stage, but instead of blinding me, it gave me clarity. Like the world had been waiting for this unveiling as much as I had. I walked down the steps with the weight of 3 decades sliding off my shoulders one bitter inch at a time, and there she was, sitting behind the wheel of our car like a general waiting for orders, not the kind of woman you ignore. And definitely not the kind you underestimate. Harper stepped out of the car like she'd done this before, like walking into hostile territory in full daylight was something she did every other Tuesday, and maybe she had. just not usually in a cardigan and boots meant for blending in with upper-middle-class suburbia. Her hair was cropped short and neat, the way she always kept it after deployment, and her posture was so sharp it could have sliced through the front lawn hedges. She carried the manila folder like it was a weapon and not a stack of printed emails and screenshots, and for a second, I felt something that had been missing for a long time around this house: control. Harper didn't even glance around like she needed to admire the landscaping or the overly polished wreath on the door. She was here on a mission, and I loved her for it. When I walked back into the dining room, Harper just behind me, the sound of our shoes hitting the hardwood floor made everyone look up like someone had flipped a breaker. Janine actually gasped. Not the polite kind either, the kind that escapes your mouth when you realize the fantasy is over and the truth is standing right in front of you, 6 feet tall with calm fury radiating from her spine. "This is Harper," I said plainly, not needing to explain, not needing to apologize. "My wife. We've been married for 4 years. You missed the wedding. You missed the cancer scare. You missed the deployment. You missed every milestone because none of you ever asked the right questions. And frankly, you wouldn't have been invited anyway." Evan blinked at her like he was trying to solve a math problem with no numbers. Meredith opened her mouth to say something, probably a clumsy attempt at reclaiming grace, but Harper cut through the tension without even raising her voice. She reached into the folder and handed each of them a thick envelope like she was distributing final grades. "You'll want to take a look," she said evenly, her voice smooth but cold. "Each packet contains some reading material. Compliments of Claire, with my assistance." Janine touched hers like it might bite. Evan flipped his open and the first page turned white in his fingers. I watched him read the subject line of a printed email, one he clearly recognized because his face drained 3 shades of color in as many seconds. Janine looked over his shoulder and made a sound halfway between a gasp and a groan. "These are fake," she said, voice thin and nervous. "I never said any of this." Harper raised one eyebrow, the most subtle expression of disbelief I've ever seen that still managed to silence a room. "Don't worry," she replied, cool and collected. "We made copies. And backups." Inside each folder were carefully compiled pieces of the stories I never got to tell, screenshots of group chats where Janine called me a mental breakdown in heels, messages between Evan and Meredith debating whether I should be invited to last year's Christmas because I was too unpredictable, and, my personal favorite, a typed letter from my mother to one of her friends about how she believed I was emotionally unwell and a lifelong disappointment. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. They were all doing the heavy lifting now, choking on their own words in 12-point font, their private contempt no longer safely buried in group texts and polite smiles. Janine was already spiraling into denials, her voice rising with every "I never," and "this isn't what it looks like," while Evan stared down at his lap like maybe if he didn't look up, he wouldn't have to acknowledge the fire burning around him. Meredith, for once, said nothing. She just sat there, fingers trembling slightly against her coffee cup, the one with the phrase "family is everything" printed in cursive gold that now looked almost obscene in this context. I stood up slowly, letting my hands rest on the back of my chair one last time. "This brunch is over," I said, voice quiet but final. "Keep your casserole." I brought closure. I turned to Harper, who gave me the faintest nod of approval, then stepped behind me like a quiet shadow of certainty. As we walked toward the front door, Meredith finally found her voice again, sharp and brittle as ever. "You'll regret this," she snapped, louder than necessary, maybe because she thought volume could cover up the sheer panic behind the threat. I didn't stop walking. I didn't even turn around. I just said, "Already did. That's why I stopped needing your approval." And with that, we left. We stepped out into the sunlight like we were walking out of a courthouse where justice had finally tipped in our favor. Harper opened the passenger door for me like she always does, and as we pulled away from the curb, I could see Meredith through the front window, frozen in her chair, holding the folder like it was a piece of radioactive truth she couldn't touch for long. Harper kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly on my knee. "You sure that was enough?" she asked, not as a challenge, but like she already knew the answer. I looked out the window at the manicured lawns and hollow mailboxes and plastic rabbits scattered across the front yards of a neighborhood built on pretending. I watched the houses shrink in the mirror, and I said what I'd been thinking all along. "Not yet," I answered. "But it's a damn good start."